Hi, and welcome to episode 7 of this video series on the problem of evil. Today we're going to...
Hello everybody, Carl here.
Carl, what are you doing?
Well, I've decided that I want some more screen time. Tired of being behind the scenes all the time.
You're not supposed to have screen time. You're supposed to be over there working the camera and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, well, I have never.
No. Carl, come on. Let's be serious here. I'm the star of the show. You're the person behind the scenes. That's just the way it is. You're a puppet, Carl. Come on, you can't even move on your own. The only reason you're moving right now is because someone's hand is causing you to move. Probably my hand.
I can see both of your hands, so your hands aren't the ones controlling me now.
That's a good point. Who is moving you right now?
Oh, yeah, now we're confused, aren't we?
Come on, Carl. Someone's moving you. Who's down there?
Check this out.
Well,
Oh,
how are you doing
yeah,
that?
look at me go. Look at me go.
Carl.
Oh, look, I can even move around.
Oh, man, that's super
Moving
creepy. Man. Stop it.
moving
Stop
around,
it.
moving around. Come back this way.
You're freaking me out, Carl. Stop it.
Coming back. What do you say about that?
Well, so big deal. You can float without a hand, and you can
I
talk
think you've
without
underestimated.
anybody. That doesn't mean anything special. You're still a puppet. How are you doing that? It doesn't matter. You're still smaller than me. Look how small you are compared to me.
Oh, you think you're so big, huh?
Yes, you are small.
Well, maybe I'm actually bigger than you. Hey, Jake, go to the wide
Who's
angle.
Jake? Oh, Carl, what the heck?
What'd I tell you? Sweatpants.
Oh,
Now everybody knows.
man, come on. We're not supposed to go to wide angle. It's supposed to just be the torso. What if I wasn't wearing anything at all? What if I wasn't wearing pants?
All before me, tiny one.
Seriously? Carl!
Mark.
What were you doing?
Oh, I was just having a dream. Sorry about that.
What were you dreaming about?
Oh, I was just dreaming about making a video with you, actually.
Oh, Carl. That makes me feel good about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it's nice to know that, you're thinking of me and that... Was it a good dream?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was a very good dream.
Aw, Carl, that makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. All right, come on, we gotta go make a video now.
Okay.
Hi, and welcome to episode 7 on this video lecture series on the problem of evil. In this episode, we're going to explore the theodicy of the 20th century English philosopher John Hick. We're going to begin by providing a general context for Hick's theodicy by looking at how he understands God and how he understands evil. After that, we're going to explore Hick's theodicy by examining it in light of the questions we established in our previous episode. Is God responsible for evil? Is God able to stop evil? How did evil originate? Why does evil persist? And finally, will God eradicate evil in the end? Recall here that we're looking for external and internal coherence. That is, we're trying to decide, do the claims that he makes fit together to create a coherent whole? And is his theodicy coherent with external evidence, for example from the natural sciences? Once we have a general overview of Hick's theodicy, we're going to conclude by offering a few criticisms of it. Alright, let's get started. In order to understand the context of Hick's theodicy, we have to understand that he is basically creating a theodicy that stands in juxtaposition to another theodicy that is the standard theodicy of the Christian tradition, we might say. Hick identifies this as the Augustinian theodicy. In an Augustinian theodicy, according to Hick, the idea is that God created the world perfect. Human beings were perfect, the world was perfect, and somehow there was a fall from this perfection. This fall occurs from the abuse of free will from free creatures. On the one hand, there can be an angelic fall, for example, the fall of Satan. On the other hand, there's the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden. You'll note that this theodicy suggests that God is not culpable for evil because evil actually comes from the abuse of free will of free creatures. In Hick's estimation, this theodicy doesn't work. He offers a few reasons why it doesn't work, but we're going to focus on two here. First, the theodicy doesn't fit the narrative of the natural sciences. The idea that somehow humans fell and then everything fell apart doesn't quite work, given that the extinction of the dinosaurs happened, 65 million years before human beings were around. Certainly there was a lot of harm and what we might call natural evil in the world prior to human beings existing. Well, one might say, well, yeah, that's where the angels fall in. They're the ones who caused all that. But Hick adds another dimension of scientific problem to this interpretation, and that is that the very features of the world that we might want to define as evil are actually necessary in order for the evolutionary narrative to advance, or inevitable outcomes of the very systems that make life possible. In other words, the notion that all evil results from a fall from perfection doesn't really fit with the scientific narrative that these sorts of evils, these sorts of harms, are either necessary and or inevitable aspects of the physical cosmos that we inhabit. The second problem Hick identifies is a logical problem. How is it that perfect beings could fall in the first place? How do perfect beings in a perfect world somehow all of a sudden commit evil? Hick argues that the Augustinian theodicy essentially maintains that evil somehow created itself, ex nihilo, out of nothing. There's no rationale to how evil or why evil appeared in the first place in an Augustinian theodicy, because how could creatures that were in a perfect situation, who themselves were perfect, fall? This applies not only to the human fall, but also to the angelic fall. Because of these weaknesses, Hick maintains that Augustinian theodicies that rely on an angelic or human fall from perfection just don't work. We need another option. Happily, Hick maintains, there is another option from the tradition that can bypass these difficulties of the Augustinian theodicy. To develop this theodicy, Hick turns to a 2nd century apologist named Irenaeus. Irenaeus maintains that God did not create humans perfect, but rather created them as children. Children who needed to grow and mature into the kind of beings God ultimately wanted them to be. However, this maturation process required a world that was fit for soul building. That is, the process of maturing toward competent adults. And not just any kind of adult, but adults that have developed moral characteristics, moral virtues. Again, drawing on Irenaeus, Hick maintains that in order to develop these virtues, humans must be placed in a world that contains evil. In this sense, evil has a necessary function in the maturation process of humans. It is required for our soul building. Before we further unpack this idea, there's two other things we want to note. First, in his work Evil and the God of Love, Hick affirms the classical theist understanding of God. God is perfect, morally good, all-knowing, all-powerful, so on and so forth. In fact, Hick explicitly denies the possibility of rejecting these attributes of God, suggesting that, well, that's not really traditional theism. As a side note, Hick eventually qualifies his understanding of God a little bit, not necessarily based on the problem of evil, but rather based on his understanding of other religions. For example, in his work An Interpretation of Religion, Hick shifts away from a personal God and the definitive God of classical theism to a broader God who is vague enough that that God can accommodate almost any religious view. But because our focus here is Hick's theodicy, we're going to stick with his affirmation of the God of classical theism. The second point we want to consider is Hick's understanding of evil. For Hick, evil is a very broad category. It can encompass all different kinds of harms experienced by all different kinds of creatures. For Hick, moral evil that is committed by moral agents, becomes synonymous with the Christian notion of sin. And for Hick, sin is essentially a willful rejection of God's desire for us that affects not only our relationship with God, but also our relationship with other creatures around us. However, Hick also affirms the existence of natural evil, which can affect both human creatures and non-human creatures. Natural evils, in essence, are harms that are experienced by sentient creatures that, of course, derive from amoral sources. For example, predation, natural disasters, and diseases, so long as these phenomena do not originate from a moral agent. Having now a broad understanding of the context of Hick's theodicy, let's turn to our diagnostic questions to try to understand it a bit more thoroughly. Question 1, is God responsible for evil? Here, Hick is going to offer a resounding yes. God is responsible for evil. God created a world in which evil was inevitably going to obtain. However, Hick is going to maintain that God is justified in doing so because this evil serves a greater good. We'll unpack that a bit more in a few minutes. Second, is God capable of preventing the origin of evil and preventing the persistence of evil? In both cases, the answer is yes. God is capable of doing this because God is, after all, the God of classical theism. God has the power and the ability to intervene in the cosmos to bring about ends that God wants to bring about. However, Hick maintains that God is bound by logic, such that God cannot create a world in which there are free creatures who are simultaneously not free. It would follow then that Hick would maintain God cannot intervene in the cosmos to prevent evil without thereby losing any goods that are somehow tied to those evils, or without possibly losing the integrity of the systems that prevent those evils. In essence then, God is responsible for evil, and God could stop evil, but God chooses not to do so because there are some greater goods that are at stake, and apparently there is only a certain number of ways that God can bring these greater goods about. Let's unpack that a little bit by looking at the question of the origin of evil. Let's begin by focusing on the question of natural evil. When it comes to natural evil, Hick's primary focus is the phenomenon of pain. Why is there so much pain in the human and the non-human world? Hick's response is God purposefully designs the world so that the world is filled with pain, or so that creatures can experience pain. On the one hand, we can note that pain seems to be an important way of navigating our particular environment. If we touch something and it's hot, that pain signals to our brain, hey, don't touch that. However, Hick doesn't go so far as to say that pain is necessary in order for creatures to survive in their environment. He also notes that there are times when the pain that creatures experience seems to far outweigh the benefit that they receive or what they learn through that pain. So pain remains a problem. Why would God create a world in which pain would inevitably occur? For Hick, there are two reasons that God would create a world so filled with pain. Let's look at some quotes from Hick to actually unpack this idea. First, Hick writes, "In a world which lacked a stable nexus of natural law that inflicts pain upon individuals and extinction upon species that are not adapted to its demands, the evolutionary process would scarcely have progressed beyond its earliest stages, and the world would probably still be inhabited mainly by jellyfish." Now that's all well and good if you're a jellyfish. And also, Carl, I gotta think the jellyfish are kind of like, what the hell, Hick? You know, I mean, are we not important? Do we not matter? In essence, then, Hick is saying that pain seems to be necessary for the progression of the evolutionary narrative. And that's one reason why God would create or design a world in which pain was such a central facet for sentient creatures. Second, Hick maintains that the experience of pain is essential for the development of moral characteristics in human beings. And Hick freely acknowledges that a world without pain would be quote-unquote innocent and harmless for humans. However, this world would also be devoid of positive character and without the dignity of real responsibilities, tasks, and achievements. In essence, a world without struggle is a world where humans cannot take pride in their accomplishments, because there's no struggle to accomplish them. In a world without pain, there's no occasion for humans to develop moral characteristics like compassion and courage, so on and so forth. So how did moral evil originate? Here, Hick maintains that in order for human beings to have genuine freedom, God had to create some kind of distance between the human being and God's self. It could not be obvious to the humans that God existed. If it were, their freedom would be overwhelmed with this knowledge of the existence of this infinite being. Therefore, God had to remain hidden. This hiddenness is for the sake of humans to exercise their own freedom. However, Hick maintains that God's hiddenness almost inevitably led human beings to sin. In the absence of an obvious awareness of God's presence, human beings naturally turn to what made the most sense to them, the natural world around them. And in identifying with the natural world around them, humans begin to emulate it, including in terms of competitiveness with other creatures and members of our own species. In other words, God created a world such that when human beings arrived on the biological scene, they would naturally turn toward things other than God because God was hidden. And in this turn, there was an inevitable fall of humankind. It's in this sense that Hick writes, "Man's spiritual location at an epistemic distance from God makes it virtually inevitable that man will organize his life apart from God and in self-centered competitiveness with his fellows." In other words, the distance between God and the creation inevitably leads to humankind's fall. However, that distance is necessary for human beings to have a genuine exercise of freedom. Therefore, like natural evil, the origin of moral evil is in essence by design. God designs a world in which this kind of evil is inevitable. Okay, so God creates a world in which natural evil is inevitable and necessary to achieve certain goods. God also creates a world in which humankind will inevitably fall, and this is necessary for human beings to have a genuine exercise of freedom based on God's hiddenness. But why doesn't God intervene to prevent the gratuitous amounts of evil that we experience in the world? In other words, why does evil persist? A few variations of this question arise at this point. One of them is quite simple. Why does God not intervene to prevent all evil from persisting? The answer here is clear. God does not prevent all evil from persisting because evil plays an important role in the moral development of human creatures. In other words, God can't stop all natural evil from occurring because the biological narrative of evolution is necessary in order to bring about intelligent creatures like human beings. God cannot stop moral evil from occurring because if God stopped moral evil all the time, humans would become super aware of God's existence, which would somehow affect their free will. That is, that distance between God and the world would disappear. And as a result, the world would lose its integrity. Human beings would lose their genuine freedom. In essence, God does not prevent the persistence of evil for the same reason God didn't prevent the origin of evil. It is either necessary and or inevitable as a feature of a world that is conducive to soul building. There are, however, more difficult questions to be dealt with. First, why does God permit the enormous amount of natural evil that occurs in the non-human world prior to human beings even arriving on the biological scene? 2 points are worthy of note here. First, while Hick maintains that animals can experience pain, especially the higher vertebrates, he also maintains that the problem of animal pain can be grossly over-exaggerated from the mistake of projecting our distinctively human quality of experience onto creatures of a much lower and simple order. In other words, Hick maintains that the problem of animal pain is of a much lower order than the problem of human pain, because animals lack the kind of capacities that humans have, and therefore their experience of pain is much lesser. We're going to critically explore this idea at the end of the video. For now, it's just important to note that it's what Hick maintains. When it comes to pain in the natural order, Hick maintains that both the pain and the very existence of non-human creatures both exist for the same purpose. They both help create a setting in which human beings can engage in their soul-building activities. In other words, the very existence of non-human animals, as well as their experience of pain, is justified by the fact that humans receive some benefit from their existence and their pain. And again, that benefit is that their pain and their existence allows human beings to develop as moral characters. But why does God not stop to prevent what Hick even acknowledges are utterly gratuitous evils? For example, the Holocaust. What good could these evils possibly serve? Certainly these evils can't be necessary for the development of soul building. Why does God not prevent those evils from occurring? Hick refers to these kinds of evils as demonic. Not necessarily in the sense of actual demons running around doing them, he's just trying to convey the severity of the kind of evils that we're talking about. In the demonic, evil as a necessary element in a soul-making universe seems to have got out of hand, and to have broken loose from God's control. Significantly here, Hick is acknowledging that there are evils that occur in our world that seem to be so profound in their severity that it does raise the question, why does God not prevent them? Hick here is echoing the kind of sentiments that we heard from Rowe and Draper in the evidential argument from evil. Okay, it's important that we experience pain. It's important that we have some level of suffering. But Holocaust? Genocide? Are these really essential to our moral development as human creatures? Hick responds to this question by essentially appealing to mystery. We don't know. We have no good reason to explain why God allows these evils to unfold. It's also important to note that while Hick is appealing to the notion of mystery, he also appeals to the hope of an eschatological redemption, that is, an afterlife in which all suffering creatures experience eternal bliss. When it comes to the persistence of evil, Hick also deals with the theme of suffering. His understanding of suffering is such that it really only applies to human creatures, because human creatures are unique in their ability to think not just in the moment, but to extend their thought to the future and to the past. When it comes to suffering, Hick is going to maintain the same line of thought that he maintained with pain. That is, suffering is necessary as a feature of a world that is conducive to soul building. Seeing others suffer allows us to build compassion, to build courage, to build kindness and care, and so on and so forth. But Hick also acknowledges that there is some suffering that is so extensive that it obliterates the person who suffers it. In essence, it robs them of their ability to engage in soul building. And Hick acknowledges that this is a problem. For example, he writes, "We can see that a world in which evils exist, in at least a moderate degree, may be a better environment for the development of moral personalities than would be a sphere that was sterilized of all challenges. The problem consists rather in the fact that instead of serving constructive purpose, pain and misery seem to be distributed in random and meaningless ways, with the result that suffering is often undeserved and often falls upon men in amounts exceeding anything that could be rationally intended." Now let's take a moment here to acknowledge that Hick often uses the term man to refer to all humanity. So how do we deal with such evils? These evils that are so random and gratuitous that nobody in the right mind could say, well, clearly there's a good purpose for this. Even the skeptical theist, who might hope there is a good reason, or who might believe that there's a reason that's beyond our understanding, would still acknowledge it's beyond our understanding. It doesn't make sense to us. What do we do with those evils? And again, Hick here appeals to mystery. We just don't know. We don't know why God doesn't prevent that level of suffering, those kinds of evils. But his appeal to mystery goes a bit further, and he actually uses it as a feature of his soul-building theodicy. Hick maintains that humans' lack of knowledge with regard to why these evils might occur is part of a soul-building environment. In other words, the fact that we don't know requires us to develop more faith, more character, than if we did know. If we had absolute understanding of why all this happened, it might affect our ability to develop our moral character. Furthermore, if God did intervene anytime something gratuitous happened, then we would say, oh look, God is keeping things in line. And again, our freedom might be somehow compromised by that breach of divine hiddenness. In essence then, God's absence, even in the midst of horrendous evils, might be part of the soul-building experience that we all share. The pure irrationality of the types of evil that occur in this world make the world itself all the more ripe as a place for the development of moral character. To recap, evil originates because God designs the world such that evil will occur. God does this because evil is necessary for the soul-building process of humans. For the same reason, God does not prevent the persistence of evil, again because it's necessary for the soul-building process. Even in its most gratuitous forms, Hick maintains, it may serve some function, even if that function is presenting humans with the sheer irrationality of the kind of evil that occurs. So what about our third question? Will God eradicate evil? Hick maintains the answer is yes. God will win a definitive victory over evil. And those creatures, or at least those human creatures, who have experienced suffering, will experience an afterlife of eternal bliss. God can do this because, again, the reason God doesn't stop evil isn't because God can't. It's because God chooses not to produce some greater good. It therefore stands to reason that once that greater good is achieved for God, God could then come in and eliminate all evil and create an eternity of bliss for all of God's creatures. Or at least all of God's human creatures. Sorry, Carl. Sucks to be a wolf. Hick is adamant that this eschaton is not a matter of compensation for the suffering that has been experienced. It is rather an invitation of all human creatures to experience eternal bliss. In this vein, Hick writes, "The good eschaton will not be a reward or compensation proportioned to each individual's trials, but an infinite good that would render worthwhile any finite suffering endured in the course of attaining it." In other words, Hick argues, God will achieve a definitive victory over evil. Human beings will participate in that definitive victory by way of an afterlife, and that afterlife will be an experience of eternal bliss such that no one will regret the process by which it was brought about. We will all say God was just in doing what God did to bring about that end. Having now examined Hick's theodicy in terms of God's responsibility for evil, in terms of God's power vis-a-vis evil, in terms of the origin, the persistence, and the eradication of evil, what can we say by way of critical evaluation? I want to note 3 interesting critiques that have been leveled against Hick. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list. There have been numerous critiques leveled against Hick, and you can continue to read and research on those if you're interested. But 3 critiques that I think are worth mentioning right now. First, Hick's appeal to mystery in the face of horrendous or gratuitous evils seems problematic. After all, we could imagine any world with any amount of evil, 10 times more gratuitous than the evil we experience here, and Hick's argument would still apply. Well, maybe the mystery of this horrendous evil is important for us to help soul build. In other words, there seems to be no type of world that Hicks' argument couldn't justify. And that's the problem with an appeal to mystery. It seems like it could be applied almost everywhere. A second critique that's worth mentioning is the way that Hicks deals with pain in the non-human creation. Hicks' reading of animal capacities doesn't quite sit easily with the work of animal behaviorists and the more recent findings of neurologists. Many of these scholars claim that animals have a great level of capacity that is, granted, less than human capacity, or at least less than the capacity of some humans, but nonetheless much greater than many philosophers historically have thought. We're talking in terms of consciousness, in terms of reason, in terms of language. Animals seem to have a number of traits and capacities that Hicks seems to deny them. It would therefore follow that Hicks' understanding of animal pain doesn't quite do justice to the issue at hand. He seems to think that we are over-exaggerating the issue if we think of them too much in human terms. Certainly that's possible, but we can also under-exaggerate the issue if we create too sharp a divide between all humans and all non-human animals. Hicks is not guilty of the former crime, but he may be guilty of the latter crime. There's another problem that goes in line with Hicks' theodicy here, and that is his understanding of animal existence and pain is extremely anthropocentric. That is, he maintains that the millions and millions of years of animal suffering before humans ever even arrived on the planet, the extinction of countless species, and the deep suffering of many creatures, all of that is somehow justified in order to create a world in which humans can morally develop. The sheer anthropocentrism of this view seems quite problematic. After all, Hicks may be right in noting that God could not create a world in which human beings were perfect like that human beings had to develop toward maturity through soul building, but certainly God could have created the world like that was already well along in the evolutionary narrative right before human beings appeared. That would eliminate the millions of years of suffering before human beings appeared. So why didn't God do that? Again, Hicks' view is so anthropocentric that he doesn't seem to take seriously enough the deep kind of pain that animals might experience. A final critique is there seems to be an internal inconsistency with the way that Hicks deals with the plight of individual victims in his theodicy. His appeal to mystery in the face of horrendous evils as a feature of a soul-building world doesn't quite do justice to the creatures who actually experience those horrendous evils, who are obliterated by them. Here's an interesting example. Imagine an infant, or a young child, who is obliterated by a terrible disease, experiences a great amount of pain, and then dies extremely young. It is true that that child's suffering may create an opportunity of soul building for all the people around the child. But when does that individual child get to experience soul building? Now, perhaps we may say that God will resurrect that child and that child will live in an afterlife. But again, that child has not had the opportunity of soul building. So when does that happen? If it happens in the afterlife, then it seems that we must acknowledge that creatures can experience adequate soul building in an afterlife after evil has been eradicated. In which case, why did all of the rest of us have to live through this world with all of its evil? If the child doesn't experience soul building in the afterlife, well then, isn't that child missing out on something important in God's creative project? Either way, the plight of that individual creature seems overlooked. It is subsumed into the overall holistic good that Hicks envisions in light of suffering. But certainly, for a God who knows every sparrow that falls, and knows each person by name, it seems that God would be concerned with those individuals who are suffering. Their evil, their unique experiences, also must be accounted for in the theodicy. Not only does Hicks' theodicy not clearly do that, it seems to create areas of contradiction when we consider what that might look like. Now, to be clear, there are other critiques of Hicks' theodicy. I've simply here focused on 3 briefly, so that you could understand that there may be some work left to do in the soul-building theodicy to really make it make sense in light of our actual experience of reality. Still, Hicks has provided a scientifically astute and theologically sophisticated way of exploring the world in which we live, and attempted a decent theodicy to try to explain the world in which we live. He does appeal to mystery, but there are times where his explanations seem to make sense in terms of the general feature of soul building. And yet, there are questions that seem unanswered, problems that seem unresolved. And so, while we can acknowledge that Hicks' theodicy has much in favor of it, it doesn't quite make belief in God an extremely rational position yet. There are too many loose ends. Perhaps there's another theodicy out there. In our next episode, we're going to consider the theodicy of Gregory Boyd, who relies heavily on the fall of Satan as a way of explaining natural evils that occur. Until then, see you later.